I'd like to have our two guests for our first dialogue come on up. We need a mic. Verena and Erich. We get the mics. Come on up. Yeah, come on up. You can jump or you can do the easy way. Give them a hand. Come on up. Come on. Just good. It's the color scheme. Here we go. All right. Verena, Erich, first of all, thank you for being here. So, Verena, what does everybody in the room need to know about you?
Well, many people met me yesterday. So for those who haven't, I'm a forest engineer by training. I love nature, and I'm excited being here with you for the next couple of days to think about how we can make sure that we use nature in a way that will benefit us as well as future generations.
And some of the research which you do at the ETH is focused on?
So my team and I focus on answering questions related to what to do, where and when to get the most out of our forests and to ensure that we can enjoy both the ecosystem services as well as the products coming from our forests.
Yeah, that's great. We're coming to that a little bit more. Erich, what does everybody need to know in this room need to know about you?
I guess that my grandfather was actually living in the mountains. He was a farmer in the mountains in a village like this one.
Yeah.
And I spent almost all my vacation as a kid here. So these places mean a lot to me. It's a little further west from here, but I'm deeply attached to these places.
Beautiful. And professionally, right. What do you do professionally?
That's secondary, right?
Yeah, the other stuff, all that,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a climate scientist. Yeah. I'm running climate models and computers. I'm looking at statistics of past weather and climate, how it changed, particularly in Switzerland, Western Europe, but also across the globe. And we're also looking into the future and trying to understand what our decisions mean for the future, where are we going to head, and also more and more try to advise people what it will mean to them and what they basically should be using as a basis to plan for the future.
Great. So I'm going to stay with you for a few minutes, Erich, because I'm going to come back to you to kind of say, okay, he's just told us a bunch of stuff. What does this mean, right? So I also want to talk a little bit about the forest, what the forest does. So I know from your models, you've been doing a bunch of future scenario models in Switzerland. First of all, can you explain a little bit what the models are? And what do they tell us and what can they not tell us? Like when we talk about modeling, what does this mean? Is it like they glue and plastic and wood and no?
They're typically not. No, typically, I mean, most people have a feeling what weather forecast models are. So they're basically describing the atmosphere that's out there in some basic physical principle, and that's one of the key important. So I don't want to bore you this morning with physics classes, but I think for me, the confidence I have in these models is also why they work so well, is that they're purely based on physical understanding. So thermodynamics, we can describe what's happening in the atmosphere in relatively simple equations, and those are actually not changing in time, and that helps a lot. So we're also using more and more AI-based models, but the big confidence I have in our climate models is actually that they're rooted in physics, and these physical principles stay there. And so we try to describe them, and they're quite complex, all these math equations, so we can't solve them in our head. So we need very fast computers to do that for us. And then we can represent what's happening in the atmosphere, over land, in the oceans, and over ice. And so, you ask about limitations, right? So
exactly.
If we go basically to the scale of these mountain valleys, then it becomes more and more complicated because we get to very small scale process. If you want to understand the wind system in Engadine or even in this small valley, Jumeirah, right, then it becomes more and more complex, and these are the factors we cannot fully represent.
Right. So I think that's really important. There's three things I think are really important for me, for us. And to always remind ourselves the differentiation between weather and climate. Right, that's number one. Number two is the scale. Right, because the scale at which you are very confident and the scale at which you're a little bit less confident, right? And then there's the scale at which one can really consider change happening. So talk about the last one a little bit, about the change which you see happening when we're looking out to the Zukunftsszenarien Schweiz, the work you've been doing. What are some of the changes in the climate that you feel with a great Wahrscheinlichkeit, probability, are going to be occurring here?
Can I start with the backcasting, looking backward a bit to start with?
Sure,
So-
you can.
so what- so
You've
to-
got the mic too. I mean,
Right.
you can do anything you want, dude. And it's like,
Right. I mean, today is a day, right, where we really want to be up here, right? So today, the forecast in Zurich and Geneva and Basel is 32 to 36 degrees. And up here, the Meteo Swiss forecast about 26 in the late afternoon, so which are temperature which basically did barely happen, really, really rarely. I looked it up yesterday. Samedan has a really long station series. If you look back, days above 25 degrees barely existed before the 1960s and 1970s. And this has been changing. Now we're about at 1 to 2 weeks across these temperature. Typically, they started to occur in late July, early August, but now we're end of June, as you all know, and this is really unusual. It shouldn't be happening in the past. So that's one sign of how things have been changing. Switzerland has warmed by 2.9 degrees. It's very hard to grasp what this actually means. But in the mountains, it's actually easiest to visualize it. It means that everything basically moved up by about 400 meters. And if you look out of the tent, if you can see it, 400 meters is about the top of where you see the trees, right? So this is basically up there. We today have the climate that used to be down here in La Punt. So things have been moving up. So this is a process that is just going to continue like this, because a lot of the things of the factors that have been causing this change are still here, and they're still continuing, and so we expect this to continue into the future.
I'm going to say two things just to emphasize what you've said. 2.9 degrees. Switzerland, you keep talking about 1.5. Now the world as an average is at 1.6, but you've just said 2.9.
That's correct, because we're over land. Number one, land are warming faster than the oceans. If you think about the heat capacity, how much energy it takes to heat the spaghetti, right? And if you think about the whole ocean, so these are warming slowly. Has huge implications though for the oceans. So land is warming faster. Then number two, Switzerland has mountains, and white surfaces are melting away, so black surfaces come forward. They absorb more incoming solar radiation. This further amplifies. Mountains generally warm a little more than the lowlands. Mm-hmm. And then we've also been probably a bit unlucky with the trend that we've seen in the last few decades.
Yeah. And the other thing before I come to you is that you just said, which is new to me, that 26 was hardly ever recorded in this valley before. And we're only in June. We haven't even gotten to the hot months yet.
Correct. And it's correct. So you could, Meteo Swiss calls it summer days if temperature exceeds 25 degrees. Mm-hmm. And this is simply, down in Squall it's slightly different. So it's really elevation dependent. But up here at these altitudes, we're a mile high, right? A little more than a mile high here. Mm-hmm. These are temperature and that haven't happened in the past. You see, actually, it's not only a doubling, it's really an increase by a factor of from the 70s to today by a factor of 7 to 10.
Wow. That's pretty sobering. And our forests do a lot for us. And they're going to be feeling this heat. So first, Verena, tell us a little bit about what do the forests do for us?
Well, I think this is a question I could probably speak about the entire morning, because there's so many things.
Okay, you have 3-4 minutes. How's that? Okay, then we'll keep going.
We're sitting on chairs made from wood. We are maybe enjoying a bed made from wood. We have maybe been eating a pizza that has been cooked on a real wood fire. If we go into the forest in the summer, we enjoy a cooling effect that the forest provides. Mm-hmm. Maybe we have eaten meat coming from the forest. And of course, we enjoy the fact that forests store and sequester carbon, which is a important component when it comes to combating climate change. And now with everything that Erich has said, of course, the forest engineers have to react. So forests are highly dynamic systems. And I've spoken to some of you before about the fact that we as humans tend to really not grasp that dynamic because we have this limited viewpoint of a human lifespan. So we see something, we've known it as a child, it used to be this, your grandfather's forest had a lot of spruce in it. And that really doesn't capture the entirety of these dynamics that have happened since the last ice age. And with that in mind, and what Erich has just said, we have to rethink how we manage forests. We have to realize that we are dealing with a dynamic system that has never been in a, let's say, state that we can protect, but that it has been changing over hundreds of years, over thousands of years, and now we have to help it change so that it can cope with the increase in, let's say, change or increase in speed of change that we have caused as humans. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because trees have always adapted, as I just said. They have moved to new locations. They have, during the ice age, maybe found refugees somewhere in a small warm valley. But now with the climate changing so fast and the trees changing so slowly or growing so slowly, they cannot keep up speed. And that is where we come into play, and we basically try and find out where future or what the future forest could look like, and then we try and help the forest to grow into that state faster than it would naturally.
So there's two things here. One, you said trees move. I'm trying to imagine these trees like walking or slowly up the. So when we think of trees moving,
think of Lord of the Rings.
Think Lord of the Rings. Yeah. No, I can totally go with you on that one. I'm just trying to think here. I think it's really important to understand that this idea of trees moving, because the trees don't move. It's where they can live moves.
That's right. And then I know you wanted to speak about a bird, right?
I did.
So let's speak about a little bird that really loves to eat the seeds of Pinus sembra, Arve,
the Arven, yeah.
a local pine. And that bird is very characteristic for, let's say, regional forest development, because it eats the seeds of the tree. Mm-hmm. And it does not only eat them, but like a squirrel, it stores them away for harder times.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in doing so, it has basically spread the seeds into various locations, and then it forgot to eat some of those seeds, or maybe it has been eaten itself, so it couldn't get back to its little stash. So the trees had an opportunity to start growing in places where it wasn't able to grow before over time. And that would be one way how trees move. Other tree seeds dispersed by wind, for example, the lighter seeds. So everything that is heavy that you may want to eat as well, or that you can find on the ground, is usually dispersed by some sort of an animal. Yep. And everything that's light and floats is dispersed by wind.
Which is very quite interesting, because the Arvenholz, this is a very special wood type we have up here, sort of aromatic, It is, as you said, the seeds are spread by this bird. And he or she eats, I guess, or berries, about 30,000 of them per year. I mean, I might have one zero too many. Someone who really knows their birds. How many seeds get buried in?
Lots of seeds.
Lots of them, and but they're only in a certain range. So because the bird gets afraid of moving too far out of security. So this is the movement, is not just the seeds themselves, but it's the animals that move them. So it's this whole ecosystem that's being hit by this. And so then the zone gets squeezed, and that's what's going to happen. So.
And maybe if I may add, it's not only that the habitat of the bird changes, but the trees, of course, also need specific climate conditions to grow. So they need a specific amount of precipitation. They need a specific warmth in specific months. And with climate change, what we see is summers coming earlier, summers being drier and warmer, hotter, fewer rainy days and more rain in the winter. And with this shift, of course, we change what can really happen on the ground dramatically. And we may only experience the warmer days and start considering buying an air conditioning unit for our office. But the trees really experience it at a much different scale. So for them, it's grow or don't grow, meaning expanding into a new habitat or retreating from a habitat.
Yeah. So you also explained to me, I was talking with the forester, Herr Forstein, who's responsible for this area, and he was explaining about Schutzwälder, the role of the forest in protection. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Switzerland, as you know, is a country that has lots of steep mountains. And having said that, over 50% of the forest in Switzerland actually does provide protection function. And protection function in this context is meant as protection from gravitational hazards. So basically infrastructure and people in the valley are protected from landslides, avalanches, rockfall, etc. And we do have forests in place. Ideally, they are very heterogeneous, so they are vertically and horizontally high in structure, so they can intercept things that are coming from above and they stabilize the soil. And with climate change, we do see challenges as in these forests not regenerating enough, the structure going declining, they're not as structured as they should be. And we see a third thing happening, and that is neophytes are moving in, so plants that are not originally from Switzerland. Specifically, for example, in Ticino, we see Götterbaum moving in, and Götterbaum is spreading very rapidly via a rhizome, like a strawberry basically, and it does only root very shallowly. Now it's great against rockfall protection for smaller rocks, but the moment something bigger comes, that bigger, whatever it might be, will rip out those trees. But it grows very fast, like maybe also the raspberry and blackberry in the forest. The moment you have too much light, it'll cover the entire ground so that our little trees that take a little longer to grow can't outcompete it.
Yeah, so it's this competition. It's like this fierce competition for survival. And one of the interesting things with these Schutzwälder is they need to stand, and we need to make sure that they're going to be surviving and protecting us. And which means also with the climate change, we have to think of different types of species that might be able to work. But so they're also, the typical life of a forest is around 100 to 150 years of a tree.
Yeah, so it very much depends on the species. Of course, the redwoods in California can grow much older. We do know some oaks that are over 300 to 400 years old. But in Central Europe, 100 years is a solid number. The forests that we manage for timber, we harvest much earlier. A spruce in the lowlands can grow, let's say, in 60 years to a size that is nice for construction wood, for example.
Right. Eric, go ahead.
Just wanted to basically underline or support what has been said, what Verena said, in terms of we Engadinis tend to be relatively dry. So it is one of the mountain valleys that are drier than the average that we get in precipitation in the mountains. We are at 700 millimeters, probably doesn't mean much to you, but it's like 30% less than we have in other places. And what we expect, as Verena correctly said, in the future is that it becomes more variable, right? So we have longer stretches of no rain, and currently we're up at about a month sometimes here with no rain. And then when it rains, it pours, right? Then we get actually the big amounts. And that's actually also a challenge for the creeks and the rivers around here, because currently there's a lot of meltwaters, right? So in the hot summers, usually they actually save us through the summer by providing a lot of meltwater. But if the glaciers and the snow melts away, so they basically, it's going to be also a bigger amplitude between more runoff in winter and then less in summer. And obviously also when it rains a lot, then obviously it becomes a question of flood risk. And when I looked at this yesterday, I thought, okay, this is actually where these two rivers come together. Probably is an area, and I looked at the hazard map and I realized, well, they're well aware of that, and already there's lots of plans of actually renaturating in. And so there have been events in the 1960s here that flooded, and also earlier, and I think they're exactly trying to do the right thing, to give more space to the rivers, to basically go back to where they were naturally, and I think that's typically the best strategy to do.
So you said very interesting is 400 meters. Excuse me. So the future is actually, if you will, down the valley. So we've got to look lower to see what the future is going to look like. So when we think of that, Verena, what does this mean for you as a forest person? When you take I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, when we look out, what's going to be different, say, in your mind's eye, what do you believe will be different when we're looking out around here in, say, 50 to 100 years?
So what we will definitely see is trees in places where we currently don't see trees when we look up the mountain, because the natural range of trees will move up. The tree line as we see it today is limited by temperature. So we do have an area in the mountains where it becomes, where the growing period becomes too short for trees to really grow. And what Erich said earlier is basically going to happen. So everything is going to move up the mountain a little bit. So we'll see some of the species that we currently find in the lower elevations moving up the mountain. And what that also brings with it is that we do see a change in, obviously, the trees we find and the animals that are related with those trees.
Oh, interesting. So tell me more about that, the animals, because if we have less snow, that means some of the rabbits and some of the birds might not be able to hide.
Yeah, that's right. So we do have a lot of animals in the Alps that are adapted to snow in the winter. And those are the animals that change their fur or coat to white so they can better hide. And now, naturally, as you can imagine, if as a white bird, like a snow ptarmigan or similar, you stand on a green meadow, your camouflage effect is nullified, right? So we already see that happening. These little birds fall prey to other birds, and also they do die of heat exposure. Particularly little chicklets, they can't cope with the heat. And then there's another species, I think that is a good time to slip in a piece of knowledge that I personally find very interesting, and that is that half of all species of national interest in Switzerland can actually be found in the forest, and one of them would be the capricorn. So capricorns are, one of the, let's say, mascots even of the canton, and for them it does get too hot too. So they try and climb up to higher elevations already much earlier in the year. They have very thick coat. They try to stay in the shade, not to overheat, and they are really struggling with the heat.
So, Erich, you said you came up here. Thank you for that. When you came up here as a child, and you've seen a lot of change happening, what do you see looking forward?
I mean, one thing that I notice is really that the landscape, in the color of the landscape changes. In some of the mountains you actually see them, and I looked at a picture of my childhood, the mountains were white, not only in winter, but really into May and so on. Yeah. And that made them really impressive. And now if you look around, you actually see a lot of rubble and black. Yeah. There's in famous downhill ski, they often put the camera on what's called the silver horn. Yeah. And in one year, suddenly it turned actually gray, and they sort of turned the camera away because the silver horn is no longer silver, white, but it's actually becoming so black. Yeah. So that's one thing, right? So I see it mostly in winter and spring, actually, where you really see that. There is still occasionally snow. There are still these winters where we get plenty of snow, but it just becomes more variable. And that's a challenge, right? If you look, we walked by the T-bar, the ski lift over there, and that's one of them. I learned to ski on one of those, right?
Oh,
the
really?
Small ones,
yeah.
The family ones, not in the big resorts. And there's still going to be winters where you can actually open it, but it's going to be more variability there. Yeah.
And if I may, I think one of the challenges that we all have to deal with it is that we romanticize our memories. And I do have pictures like that too. And we think of it as the better past. But that is really not the case. It is a different past. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it was better. And we have to remind ourselves that we live in a dynamic system. And this was one status of this dynamic system that we very much enjoyed. Now we're in a different status, and somehow we have to think about what future statuses might look like and how we get there.
I think that's actually the key there, the future statuses. And you said plural, because there's multiple possibilities. So what would you want to make sure that everyone in the room thinks about as we're thinking about these multiple futures? Erich, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is really critical that all of us take in our heads and our hearts as we think about these pathways for the future? Oh, I tell you what, I'm going to do this. You both can think about that. I want all of you, it's your turn now to ask some questions. I'd like you to turn to your neighbors and like between you, 2, 3, come up with 1 or 2 stumper questions. Who'd like to start? Andrea. Shyness here. Who's going to be second? Who's going to be up next? Okay, and Carol's up next. Okay. All right.
Hi. We were wondering if you said that the tree line, or the climate has changed, that the tree line could actually rise up like 400 meters. If there is now permafrost that is rising higher up, could basically one kind of effect of climate change be used to counter-effect another effect of climate change, that we accelerate planting trees at higher altitudes with like strong roots keeping together the soil, so that instead of like a 500-meter band of wood, we have an 800-meter band of wood that then protects the valleys from mudslides and other things.
One for both of us.
Go for you, whoever can answer it, yeah.
So temperature-wise, yes, I think temperature-wise it should actually work. So basically, if the conditions move up, but there's more to trees, and actually probably hand over, right? So there's humidity, and then you need to have the soils, in principle, also to be ready to sustain the trees. But that's definitely something that people have been thinking about. Whether they can do it here, I hand over to you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and something that people have started thinking about, particularly because of snow and those threshold areas being an area of specific interest, because that is where you can really see things happen. And one thing there is to say is that they cannot do it on their own. And when I say they, I mean the trees, because you still have snow, particularly where you have the residues of permafrost. And what that means is that you have snow gliding basically throughout the winter. And the snow gliding down the mountain rips out the little trees. And then you have a switch in spring immediately to much drier conditions. And the baby trees only have very short roots. So that means they cannot access the water that is a bit deeper in the soil. So first they're being ripped out. And maybe you've seen what is in German called Säbelwuchs on the trees. Maybe if we go for a walk later in the forest, you can join us at 1:15 at the InHub for a little forest walk with Erich and myself.
Short little advertisement there for a very interesting walk with Erich and Verena.
That's right. So, but you'll be able to also see on your own trees growing like this, and that is caused by snow gliding. So basically the trees are pushed down again and again, and they don't just grow like this out of the soil, but like this. And
I didn't know that.
Yes, see?
Cool.
And to help them grow, we put tripods into the very steep areas. So these are basically 3 pieces of wood that can be put together at the top, and then the tree is growing protected underneath. But of course, to bring a tripod up to the mountain is not easy, and we've heard the helicopter earlier today, and often it's done by helicopter. So these tripods are assembled on the ground in the valley bottom, and then they're flown up to the mountain. And that is why, for me, this is like music. I'm like, they're protecting the forest.
They're working the forest. Makes you
That's
happy.
right.
Okay, great answer. Carol, you're the next. Who wants the next question? All right, Juliet will be next.
Well, we have twofold. The question is twofold.
One question.
Yeah, it's one question, but twofold, if you allow. We have the people, the masses, and we have the technicalities of the change that needs to happen. So you're probably working on what on a technical side or solution side needs to happen. And we were wondering how, or are you thinking about how to involve the masses that are today more resignated, frustrated people into maybe being part of the solution? Is that okay, Chris?
That was a beautiful question, Carl. Beautiful. Both of them, you and Reto, that was amazing.
You know, I'm trying to do this by speaking in the media and in do a lot of outreach work. And I think what really, where I shifted to is basically showing that there are solutions to some of these challenges, right? So basically, and that climate protection doesn't mean just stop doing anything that we used to do, but there's actually a lot of co-benefits, both in climate protection, but also in adaptation, saying that making urban areas resilient to heat basically makes them greener, makes them also more attractive. Doing flood protection, that the way that it's planned here is actually it has a lot of positive co-benefits. It's good for biodiversity. It's also more attractive for tourists to walk along a river that has space than one that is basically engineered. And the same holds even to reduce some of your emissions. Traveling low carbon or low carbon nutrition is healthier, right? I try to go a lot of to basically try to think positive, as we also try to do in this week, because I think that's the one way to bring. Plus, then also stay with the fact and say that's where we are and that's what we need.
On the forest side of things, it's almost easy, I'd like to say, because everyone has some emotional tie to forests. Everyone has some memory of, walking in the forest with friends or family, etc. So people are really interested in seeing that change happening. And there are lots of projects that people get involved in. And there are also, let's say, lots of practitioners that actually turn to us and say, hey, we see this change happening and how can we do it better? So we basically talk about the technicalities much sooner than one might think. So there is not a big issue. The one challenge I like to say that we have been seeing is overcoming this memory of myself and maybe previous generation when it comes to species choice, in particularly the lowlands.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Great. So I see Caitlin, Juliet is going to... Let's move it up there. Juliet, then did you have a question? No. Go for it. Go for it. Yeah, go for it. Go for it, then we'll give it to Juliet next, and then back there. Okay, we'll zigzag.
Okay. We were discussing about the forests and the different kinds of forests, so old growth forests versus ones that are maybe more harvested or more managed. And we're wondering, is there a difference in what we have to consider for climate change, the impacts on these different kinds of forests? And then in a second step, how do we see the future of all the resources needed? I mean, you say like helicopters that fly tripods up to protect one little tree. How do we, how are we thinking about how we can expand the expertise or the resources needed to do these actions?
So maybe a quick word on the numbers. The protection function that Swiss forests provide are estimated at 4 billion Swiss francs per year. So in theory, we don't fly the helicopter up to protect the little tree, but we have to think of it as flying the helicopter up to enable the tree to protect us in the valley and our, infrastructure. And then you asked about old growth forests versus maybe more production-oriented forests. And yes, there are differences. And yes, there are differences in how they can be managed. Though I really am not a big fan of the term old growth forest, because in theory, in Central Europe, we don't have any old growth forests at all. They've all been harvested at some point. And we do find a couple of refugees somewhere, maybe 100 square meters, but very, very few. And the optimum condition, from my perspective, would be mimicking what nature does, and that is a planter forest system. So like a system that has lots of different species, lots of different age categories, and is very diverse. Now, of course, for timber production, we have economies of scale, and going in every 20 years harvesting one tree is not as efficient as driving your harvester through a willow or poplar plantation and just cutting it all down. And one solution to that challenge is to really look at the landscape and say, here in Switzerland, we do have the plateau that might be more suited for timber production. We do have the alpine forests that might be more suited for planter forests, and decide where we do what. And in doing that, we might also deal with an additional challenge that we have, and that is that Switzerland is a net timber importing country. So at the moment, we get timber to satisfy our needs from other countries, and who knows how other countries manage their forests, right?
We're going to just let that be like a fact drop. We can talk about that in a different moment. I didn't know that, actually. That's quite interesting. Juliette.
Thank you very much. My question is to Erich. In your opening, you said what our decisions mean for the future. That was one of your opening lines. And I'm here wondering, do you think that we are making any progress with the decisions that we are making? And this is within the UN multilateral system spaces, the UN Conference of Parties that happens every year, and we're making new decisions every second. Do we need to rethink these? Are they even necessary? And I'll just tie this to Verena and ask you, do you think that the carbon market credits offset movement should worry us as foresters as well?
That was a very
Yeah,
stumper question.
You
Go,
asked
girl.
for the stumper question. Wow.
Okay.
Okay. Whoa. Where should I start?
right.
So yeah, it's a big question where probably a lot of people here also have their opinions, and there's lots of more experts in here on this. But so one thing that I think is important to understand is that that yes, the emissions are still continuing to rise. They actually increase. Slowed slightly down. But if you look at really what early business as usual pessimistic scenarios were, they were higher. So there is progress in some countries, and there's clearly progress in awareness. So I've been giving outreach talks for many years that the discussion have shifted. There are still a few people that are talking about the same old things, and yes, I could probably repeat all their argument over and over again, but they're sometimes fact resistant, but a lot of the people have shifted in trying to basically, how do we best do with that? And then also in terms of emissions, yes, countries have substantially reduced. So we are still at very high per capita emissions. Some of the reduction have been happening simply by exporting our emissions, and meaning now that we import the goods, basically that now they're produced elsewhere. But overall, there has been progress in that sense that probably if we hadn't talked about this challenge, the emissions would have been growing faster and faster. Then the Conference of the Parties, I'm not attending those. I'm really more in the physical climate science and less in the negotiation. I've been asking the same question over and over again to the colleagues. I think what we need to understand that the time of building these frameworks and these networks is actually also a huge progress. So the things that we actually been benefiting a lot between like the frameworks, that we can now quantify how much this some sectors, how much do some companies, how much do some countries emit. We have standards, etc. People are talking to each other. Things are moving incredibly slowly, frustratingly slowly. But I think the argument from my colleagues is often, if we would completely give this up, it would actually take a long time to even rebuild this sort of standard that we talk about the same thing, that we measure the same thing, and so on. But yes, progress is slow, and if you ask me, obviously also, my mood about it is oscillating, right? It used to be a bit better 3 years ago than half a year ago, so we're going a bit to that.
I think the glaciers are melting faster than the decisions are being made, and this is the harder part with that. We have one more question, and then we're going to...
Hang on a second, Chris. I think we have to answer the second part of the
okay,
question.
sorry.
And that was whether, as foresters, we should worry about the carbon market, correct?
Excuse me.
And I like to say, at some point, when this idea of us being able to sequester carbon in forests became a thing, everyone was excited finally having found a new source of income. And that made it such a big thing. What we have to realize is that a forest, as we see it, stores a specific amount of carbon. It's in the wood. and then while it grows, it sequesters carbon from its surroundings. And at some point, that system is going to be saturated. And if in Central Europe we sell carbon credits from existing forests, I think that is a horrible mistake. Because we basically sell permission for a company or someone to emit carbon that has not yet been emitted, but it's already stored. So the math don't work out. But if we do plant trees specifically with the purpose of sequestering and then ultimately storing carbon, that can work. And that is often done in Central America, South America, of course, African countries, etc. And then the next step that we can take is to make sure that we put our timber into cascading use, so that we first use it for long-term purposes, construction, etc., so that the carbon remains stored in that timber and doesn't go straight back into the atmosphere. And maybe I am allowed to do another fact drop, and that is that even in Switzerland, where we think about our decisions very well, we have legislation that basically opposes each other. So we do have subsidies for putting in pellet stoves and using lots of timber for heating. But on the other hand, we have a goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. And the two things really don't go together. And we have to think about how we can get better at creating something that satisfies both ideas.
Okay, last question, Rick, and then we're going to go to the... sorry, Rick, not Rick.
This is
Claire.
kind of about the plants again and your strategy to kind of vegetate areas. Do you always try to kind of go the naturalist, local, like the plants that are native? Do you always use that as a strategy, or are there ever scenarios where it's okay to bring in a non-native, more engineered species to kind of combat temperature change?
Yeah, very, very important question. And I think that relates a little bit to Carl's question earlier, where he asked whether or not, people are so open to taking up our ideas. And it very much depends, I unfortunately have to say. Some regions we have forest engineers and the local population being incredibly opposed to non-natives. And I mean, okay, this term alone is interesting to discuss, but then we do have other areas that are very open and have, for example, been growing Douglas fir for a long time, and Douglas fir is native to North America. So it's not from here, but it has been doing quite well and can be an alternative to spruce. And then in places like British Columbia, Canada, we have breeding programs where we specifically breed for traits like stronger resistance against specific pests, etc. And people are much more open to experimenting with things like that. So it very much depends, and I think we have to at least issue a word of caution, and that is not randomly moving species around, so we don't see a situation like with foxes and rabbits somewhere in Australia. But yes, we should be open to experimenting within the realm of what is scientifically reasonable.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to give the last word to both of you. Anything you'd like to share with our group that they need to be thinking about and aware of before we move to the next thing? Erich?
Right. Yes. I think we should take the challenge very serious. Things are changing very rapidly, but I think we also need to acknowledge it's not the end of the world, that there are, for instance, places where we can learn from, right? And so, for instance, La Punt is not going to get a climate that does not exist anywhere currently. And there are places which have actually an analog climate, we call it, to what we expect to see in the future. And I think these are places where we can learn from. Sometimes the conditions are different there, other conditions, right? But I think, at least from the climate side, we have these cases. And I think that it will be really important to always open up and look beyond the mountains here and down the valley and up the valley to learn from how other places handle the climates of the future.
And my last word is very much related to what Erich has said, and that is that with all of the discussions we're having, sometimes it can all sound quite dire, but we are here to make a change, and we do have scientific knowledge that can help us to make the world a better place also when it comes to those challenges around managing our natural resources. And in our lectures, we are taught to be cautious about climate anxiety. And when we speak about avalanches and climate change and wildfires, people tend to really get anxious and very worried. And the first thing that I tell my students is being here, being part of this discussion, actually means that they are part of making a difference, making a change for the better. So instead of being frightened and sad, they should tap themselves on the shoulder and say, I'm here, I'm making a difference, and with me being in these discussions, it's going to be possible to find a solution for the future.
Beautiful, wonderful words to end this session on. So I want to thank both of you very, very much for your wisdom and for sharing that with us. So let's give them a nice round of applause. Thank you.